All right, welcome, moms, dads, caregivers, parents, therapists, however you're joining us today. I know when we looked over who is registered for this Overcoming Anxiety webinar, we got some of you joining us for yourself, some of you for your kiddo, some of you for your whole family, and I am excited to be with you today. I'll share some of my story here in a little bit. And ultimately, I want you to know it's a journey that is not always the easiest when you're looking for answers, especially if it is for your kiddo and you see them struggling. But there are answers out there, and I applaud you for seeking and looking, and excited to share not only, as I said, my own story, but based on the neurology that we see in kiddos and adults over and over again in our office, ways that you can better understand what's going on with your family, your kiddo, yourself, and more importantly, what you can do about it to get help. I know just yesterday morning I was talking to a mom for her almost 15-year-old daughter, and she said it's like she has this sort of baseline stress inside her body, and she can see this anxiety. And mom herself doesn't deal with anxiety, so she can't relate. She doesn't quite know why it's happening. She can just see her daughter's stress. And so many other parents that we talk to have this idea of their kiddo stressed, and they tend to know the triggers, so they're trying to protect their kiddo, keep them from being triggered and going into whether it's an anxiety like full-blown panic attack, whether it's just general nervousness or activating that fight flight nervous response. And they're saying, all right, I just want to protect my kiddo so that doesn't happen. But it becomes exhausting at the same time if you're working so hard as a parent trying to help your kiddo, and you still see a little flip in the routine throw them off. And ultimately, I just want to make life easier for you and for your kiddo. So as we go through here, because our office we specialize in pediatrics, that will be a lot of the focus of the examples that I give. But if you're attending for yourself, please know that these examples are just as relevant to you. The nervous system, the pieces that we're going to talk about today, are going to apply whether it is a kiddo or an adult. So the three main things we're going to cover. First, I want to go through some different types of anxiety to help you better understand yourself and your child, both the long-term and future effects, as well as the short-term day-to-day struggles that you deal with, and then from a neurological perspective, most importantly, what you can do to help. If you don't know me, my name is Dr. Tye. I own Whole Family Chiropractic, and sometimes people wonder, why is a chiropractor talking about anxiety? It's because our office specializes in a very unique neurological approach. One of our focuses is seeing what can trigger fight flight, where is stress stuck on in the body, and what we can do to help a kiddo get out of that fight flight response into a more calm and grounded state. So between the neurological approach and then a pediatric focus, since I graduated in 2007, those have been the two main things that I really love doing. Our office sees 40 to 45% pediatrics, so we have a very um, strong expertise in that area. What I'm going to share with you, I've shared a couple times the Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health. They have an annual conference up in Duluth that I've been privileged and honored to be a speaker at 5 years now, I believe. Anyway, this content has been very well received by the mental health professionals up there. So let me start with my own story, just so you can have an understanding where I come from. This is pictures of myself, my sister Dakota, my mom. We lived out in the country just outside of Wausau, Wisconsin. And when I was in elementary school, I was a pretty happy-go-lucky kid. My dad was actually building a log house. That's what those giant logs are there. Got to run around in the woods and did pretty well until from fifth grade. This transition from fifth grade to sixth grade was really big for me because I went from this little school out in the country to the city school, and I went from 25 kids in my class to all of a sudden 330 kids in my class in sixth grade. And I remember starting sixth grade as thinking, all right, I'm going to be like open up and happy go lucky as I was in fifth grade. All of a sudden, boom, all those kids just caused me to come in and shut down. By the end of sixth grade, I started to open up. I thought, oh, maybe next year I'll go for football, some of the things I wanted to do. Until one day in sixth grade, I came home and my mom and dad were sitting there and they said, Tye, we've got to talk. Now, we love you and your sister Dakota very much, but we've fallen out of love with each other and we're going to separate. We're going to get a divorce. So fast forward a year, we moved up now to Rhinelander, Wisconsin. This was my actual sixth grade auditorium, so you can see if have a tendency towards nervousness and anxiety. If I'm in that crowd, it's going to be a lot. Anyway, now in seventh grade, we moved to Rhinelander, Wisconsin. It's home of the Hodag, if you don't know. And one of the first days of school, I remember now I'm in a brand new city. Brand new students, brand new teachers, brand new classrooms, and I don't know anyone. So I am sitting outside at recess, actually standing outside, and I'm against the brick wall of the building. And I'm looking and I'm seeing a group of kids play soccer over here, a group over there, a group over there, and I don't have any friends. So basically, I'm trying to blend into the brick wall. And my palms are sweaty, my heart's pounding, and I just feel this rush of stress chemicals flowing through my body. A week goes by, still not quite fitting in, not making any friends, and I'm in Mrs. Knox's math class. And I remember in her seventh grade math class, I did pretty well. She was asking the class a question, and another classmate raised his hand, Dustin. She calls on him. He got it wrong. I raised my hand, like, I know. I answered the question correctly, and for a moment, I was excited. But then I had this realization. I thought, wait a minute, Tye, you don't have any friends. You can't just be one-upping everyone. You're not going to make friends that way. So for the rest of junior high, high school, into college, I never raised my hand again. I shut down, became now more permanently withdrawn, didn't go out for the sports I wanted to go out to. Finally got out for golf in high school, so I started to open up a little bit, but I was way more anxious as I walked through the hallways, hoping that no one would see me, trying to blend in, trying not to cause a scene. So as we go through here today, those were some of the factors that when I was a kid that really impacted me. And fortunately, as I've grown and through neurological chiropractic, been able to put my nervous system in a state of ease, allow me to start to open up to the world, been able to do talks like this to live audiences and do really well. Still have those moments, but ultimately I want to share these strategies of success with you for your kiddo and your family as well. So the two main categories that we're going to talk about here are having to do with not the diagnosis of ADHD, or I'm sorry, not ADHD, but the diagnosis of different categories of anxiety, whether it's a phobia or social anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder, but instead what is happening in the nervous system. And this is going to allow you to see yourself, your kiddo, a little bit differently. Instead of just a label and a diagnosis, help to understand what's actually happening in their body. So when we first go into stress mode, if we're feeling anxious, feeling nervous, there's this outward sign of anxiety. And this is the initial fight-flight response that happens in our nervous system. So you might notice with your kiddo, they've got a lot of energy, they're always fidgeting, they're always moving, maybe they feel almost jittery. I mentioned for the mom yesterday where like she could see this stress in her daughter's body. Other things we might see, especially when a kiddo is younger, maybe they want to like blame others or control others, because when they can control the environment, control someone else, it helps them feel safer. There was a 6-year-old boy that came to see us, and I asked Mom, what are your goals? She said, well, I want him to feel more regulated, more grounded, less anxious, less nervous, just more calm. I asked the little boy, what are your goals? And he said, well, I want it when I'm on the playground playing, I want to be able to say something one time and the other kids listen to me. Because his own insecurities that came from anxiety caused him to be controlling of other kids. I know my screen here is covering things a little bit, but it might be labeled almost as the bad kid, more likely with this outward stress to have behaviors and tantrums and meltdowns, more likely to get in trouble at school. Misdiagnosed as ADHD is what the very bottom says here. And there was a 4-year-old boy that when we were doing the initial visit in the office, when it came time to do the scans that we do, all of a sudden he wanted to play with this over here and go over here and check on his sister over here. And at first glance, it looked like, oh, does he have ADHD the way he's bouncing around? But knowing his history and his story, when we look under the surface of that, it was actually he was just nervous and he was trying to avoid things with that constant distraction and movement. What happens then is once fight or flight kicks on so far, the body goes into freeze mode. If it goes too deep with fight or flight and becomes overcome by it, that's when freeze mode happens. It's like a possum, playing possum. You might have heard that term. Ultimately, it means that the nervous system can't drum up the resources to know should it fight, should it flight, and it goes into freeze. This is the category then that really started to identify me personally when it came to anxiety. Is on the surface things tend to seem fine, but inside there's so much brewing, so much bubbling, so much going on that it's easy for a kiddo then to withdraw or shut down or become shy. For myself, when instead of trying to make others perfect for me and control them, I didn't want to expose myself that way. So I said, wait a minute, maybe if I can be perfect myself, now no one can blame me for anything. They can't poke fun of me or look at me different. So I just work really hard to be a perfectionist, because if I don't make a mistake, then they can't judge me for it. If your kiddos may be more with stubborn shut down, that's where they're going to be afraid of new situations, tough potentially to transition from one activity to another, because that transition involves potential fear of the unknown. If there's all this stress happening inside, more likely that different body symptoms are going to show up, whether it's a headache or upset stomach, like butterflies in the stomach. Maybe digestion is off with constipation or diarrhea. There's an 8-year-old girl that we saw. I'll share her story a little bit later here, more of it. But when mom brought her in, she said there'd be days where she was nervous for school. The whole first half of the day she would spend throwing up. Myself, I don't have research behind this, but I had a lot of acne in those stressful teenage years. And I picture now there's all this stress every day at school just boiling inside me. And it's almost like that heat and that stress had to come out somehow. And then last on this list was probably my best self-defense mechanism, is being a people pleaser. If I don't make a mistake, if I just nod and agree, maybe they can't judge me for it. Again, my self-defense mechanism, still have it to this day, is just a nice big smile. If I met with confrontation, I go into people pleaser mode and try to get through it that way. So ultimately, as a parent, you start to identify these things for your kiddo, and you start to say, here's a trigger over here. If we try something new, I have to make sure I detail everything out for my kiddo. Maybe you've got 10 steps for the morning routine, and you know everyone needs to be perfect in order to get them out the door in the morning. And as a parent, it can be exhausting, because it feels like you're building these really high walls. You're building a really wide moat because you're trying to protect what's on the inside of the castle, and that's your kiddo. And you find that over time, you're just building the walls higher and the moat wider, and it becomes exhausting as well, because like at some point they've got to succeed, they've got to thrive on their own, and it isn't just about protecting them, but it's allowing them to succeed in the world. What's happening inside the body then? So we talked about the fight-flight response. Pupils dilate, skin changes color, heart starts beating, hands start sweating. And what triggers that fight-flight response in the body is a part of the brain in the emotional center. It's called the amygdala. This is, in essence, if we go back to the castle we just talked about, it's kind of like the guard on top of the castle. And he's walking around, maybe he's looking in the guard tower, and he's scanning the perimeter, and he's looking for any potential invader. If he sees enemy troops coming over the horizon, he's going to sound the alarms, and he's going to say, all right, everyone, get the drawbridge up, get all the guards out, let's get ready, because there's danger coming. This part of the brain, the amygdala, is what triggers that fight-flight response in our body by constantly surveying the scene for stress. And what happens is the more the amygdala starts to see a stressful thing, the more stressful things it wants to trigger the alarms for, and the more things it perceives as stressful. So as an example, if your kiddo one day is bullied by a kid in a red shirt, 2 days later, if they see another kid that's perfectly safe, but he happens to be wearing a red shirt, the amygdala may sound the alarm saying, red shirts are dangerous. Last time we saw a red shirt, we got bullied. So it can sound the alarms. And the challenge is the more and more things that become anxiety invoking or anxiety producing for your kiddo, the more likely the amygdala is going to sound that alarm. Dr. Daniel Siegel has a hand model where he talks about the amygdala being the thumb and the arm being the spinal cord. So messages are coming in from the body through all the senses. There's a lower part of the brain and then going into the amygdala. And the amygdala is sensing, okay, based on the information we just received, should we sound the alarm or are things safe? If it says things are safe, it now allows access to this top part of the brain. This is called the cortex, and especially what we're going to talk about today is the prefrontal cortex. It's at the very front part of the brain, and it's what makes us unique as humans. It's a highly developed structure in humans that allow us to regulate our emotions. It allows us to have executive functioning skills. So if your kiddo struggles with math or reading or school and learning, it may very well have to do with their prefrontal cortex. That's what I have here in this box in blue. It allows us to solve problems and it allows us to socialize. So we'll talk about that more. We'll mention the vagus nerve here in a little bit, but the socializing piece is actually really critical to help take us out of fight or flight as well. So if the prefrontal cortex can be activated, it allows our brain to do these things we want to do. And when it comes to anxiety, it allows us to kind of think through a situation. For example, let's say you have a phobia of spiders and you look and you see a spider. What happens is the amygdala sounds the alarm. It says, aha, there's a spider, everyone, defense is up. Now, if the alarm stays going, it's going to keep you in fight flight. However, if you can have a moment of pause and reflection, you're like, wait a minute, that is actually just like a crumpled piece of string that looks like a spider. Or you might say, wait a minute, it is a spider, but it's outside the window. It's on the other side of the window. I'm perfectly safe. That part that helps bring you down from that is this prefrontal cortex here. It helps you think through things. You may have noticed if your kid is stressful and in a stress state and emotional and all worked up, it's really tough to talk to them like, well, it's not that big of a deal. Let's talk about how the problem's solved. In that moment, you have to acknowledge the emotions and get them out of that stress state because in that moment, the amygdala is firing strong. Now, what happens is the brain and the nervous system can't be in the growth mode and the problem-solving, critical thinking mode of that prefrontal cortex. At the same time, it's in fight-flight because the alarm has sounded. So this is something that's called the amygdala hijack. And what happens is if the amygdala has sounded the alarm, with my hand here, it's like the lid has been flipped open. Now the brain is really thinking in this survival mode and it's not able to access that prefrontal cortex. If the amygdala says, all right, the guards are on the tower, they scan the horizon, they say, yep, everything's safe, we're okay here, that's what allows the front part of the brain to then be accessed. So this is the challenge, is if your kiddo is in a constant state of fight-flight, it's going to cause them to keep thinking in this lower brain and keep thinking in a fight-flight mode. If they can never access the front part of the brain, it's going to be tough for them from a social standpoint, potentially from a learning standpoint, potentially from a teaching them how to get through things and learn that maybe you don't have to be as anxious about this. So what I want to go over then is what are ways to make the connection between these two areas. When connection between those two areas happens, it allows us to bond and connect with others. And this is one of the things that I become most passionate about, especially as we're working with kiddos, is when they are in that constant state of fight flight. As you saw, this upper part of the brain has to do with socializing and meaning bonding and connecting with others. So if you're always in your fight flight mode, you're not going to want to connect and form that deep relationship. And so the more we can help kiddos get out of fight flight early on and get them feeling calm and grounded, the easier life is going to be for them, not only by feeling less anxious, but easier for them by building those relationships with others going forward. Dr. Daniel Siegel, who I had mentioned, created this hand model. He has a quote where he said, one of the best predictors of your well-being is how interconnected your connectome is, which is how the brain is connected, to think of it that way. So the more the brain can be connected, instead of just in the lower brain all the time, it has a huge impact on your and your kiddo's well-being. So next then, I want to share with you 3 strategies on how to help create this connection. The first one, labeling emotions, is something actually my wife is an expert at. She is a parent coach, and it's one of the strategies she uses. So if you like more info on this strategy or other parenting strategies, SamanthaMoe.com is her website. But basically what they found is when they did brain imaging, and this is probably going to show up small on your screen, but it comes from University of California, Los Angeles, and they showed people faces of strong emotions. When they showed people faces of strong emotions and they measured their brain activity, they found the amygdala picked up on way stronger activity. Once they had that person label the emotion, saying, oh, I was just showing an angry face. Ooh, I was showing a sad face. I was showing a depressed face. I was showing a nervous face. When the emotion was labeled, they found that that activity moved into the area of the brain that governs rational thinking. So simply by putting the words and labeling the emotion, they said, instead of this running the show, they started to get the rational thinking part of the brain running the show. So when your kiddo is having a big emotion, maybe it's a meltdown, maybe it's a tantrum, maybe it's just the fear is running through their system, just simply acknowledge them, address the emotion before trying any problem solving. The second strategy here has to do with deep breathing, which I'm sure you've heard of as helping calm and regulate the body. So I'm going to share with you 2 strategies to help this go deeper and go better. So the calming side of the nervous system, the opposite of fight flight, is the parasympathetic. It's the brake pedal for the nervous system. And 2 ways that you can help activate this better. Number 1 is when you're doing deep breathing, to put your tongue on the roof of your mouth. So this is an area on the roof of your mouth behind your teeth. When your tongue can rest there, it's very calming for the brain, because I know I just pulled the slide down, but it actually helps connect this part, the emotional part, with the reasoning part, the amygdala with the prefrontal cortex. If a kiddo, as an example, has maybe a tongue tie and they can't get their tongue up there easily, they might be more likely to feel stressed more consistently. A colleague of mine had a 5-year-old at a time where she was trying lots of things and had a tongue tie early on that they had discovered, and would have moments of relief, but found her daughter was still really anxious, nervous, had a lot of sensory issues. And she said once they had the tongue tie revised and the tongue could rest on the roof of the mouth, she noticed a huge difference in her kiddo's ability to be calm and regulated. The second piece then of this one is, once you have your tongue there, is to breathe out longer than you breathe in. So this example here, a 4-7-8 breath, you can do with me right now. I'm going to have you breathe in, tongue on the roof of your mouth. So we're going to breathe in for 4, 2, 3, 4. Hold for 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And now breathe out. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you repeat that breath, breathing in for 4, holding for 7, breathing out for 8. And when you breathe out longer than you breathe in, that helps activate the brake pedal as well. If you want to rev yourself up, psych yourself up before a sporting event or a concert or something big, you can actually flip that around. If you breathe in longer than you breathe out, it helps activate the sympathetic, the fight-flight side of the brain. And I will say that when we're talking here about getting out of fight-flight, one of the things to understand is that fight-flight in and of itself is not a bad thing. We need to have fight-flight if we're going to do a sporting event, if we're going to do a workout, if we have a deadline at work and we need to crank through a project. We don't want to be like after a Thanksgiving meal kind of comatose energy. We need that adrenaline, that cortisol, those stress hormones flowing through our body. So fight flight in of itself is not a bad thing. It's just that when it gets stuck on, it can create the overwhelm and the anxiety that we might be experiencing. Last of these 3 strategies then, and then we're going to go more into what's going on inside the body that might be a missing piece for your kiddo, is looking into the distance. Simply by getting out of an indoor space, going outside maybe to a lake or a park or the river or a field, somewhere where you could look off into the distance, it too brings the brain from this lower brain into the upper brain. So this I recommend is if you are trying to problem solve with your kiddo, get them outside, go for a walk, get everything moving. Not only is the walking helping, but by looking into the distance, it starts to calm their brain as well. And then you can start to problem solve and start to make the day better. So the theme with this is by activating the front part of the brain, it can help them, we get out of fight flight, we activate that front part of the brain, and now you can start to think about things in a different way. We're getting back that hijacked amygdala. So if this stress is getting stuck on, some of the challenge is it becomes easier for things to be perceived as stressful. I'll share an example here with my mom, who I love so much, but she's had some challenges in life, and a lot of things have triggered that stress response for her. And I can see over time things just narrowing in, and because so many things in life make her feel fearful or activate her amygdala and make her feel unsafe, so she has to be very protective in her mind to protect herself from all these things going on in the world. I kind of jokingly, and she will joke with me about it, she's like, if you want to know something that's dangerous out there, you just let me know, because I'll give you the things you need to look out for and how you can be safe around them. And then the other challenge is not only does it become easier to trigger the fight-flight response once it's been wired in the brain, but if it's always going, it's almost like the boy who cried wolf, is if it's always going, when a real threat, when a real danger comes on, it becomes tough to know the difference and react when needed. A mom brought her 11-year-old daughter to see me, and she said, I'm afraid when she gets to be a teenager that she's not going to know how to say no if she's offered drugs or told to do a stupid stunt or on a date in the backseat of the car. If all her brain knows is this stress response, it doesn't know when actually a real threat comes to be able to react to it. So now, if we go back to this castle analogy, as I said, you might find that, yes, I can do some deep breathing with my kiddo. I can do some meditation myself. I can do these strategies, and it gets me through a moment. But if you find that you keep getting triggered, or that you have to work so hard to do all these things, it feels like you're just barely holding it all together, and when one little thing's off, the floodgates open and a panic attack starts. If you find this struggle here, what we look for in our office then is, what if something is stuck on inside the nervous system? What if there's a stress that is triggering fight flight from the inside? So for the sake of an analogy, when we work with people, we're looking to see, all right, you've been working hard on building the walls high and the moat wide. You've been working hard on protection. But what if there was a robber already in the castle. Now, it wouldn't matter how high the walls are because he can already in the castle. He can lower the drawbridge and open the gate and let all the intruders from the outside in way easier. I like the Robin Hood movie when I was a kid on Disney. Anyway, I like the castle analogy because it paints this picture of if there's stress already inside the body, it doesn't matter what you're doing from the outside. It's going to keep creating and triggering this stress response. So where does that come from? There's two things we're going to talk about here. Number one is the brake pedal. So the nervous system, the brain is sending messages to the heart, the lungs, the stomach, all the parts of the body. And there's one critical area in the upper neck that controls part of the nervous system called the vagus nerve, or one of the nerves in the nervous system. And what happens is the gas pedal is what gets our car revved up. So we're driving our car, put our foot on the gas, it gets it going. We put our foot on the brake to slow things down. If we're driving our car and we see a stoplight, we want to be able to push our foot on the brake, our car should slow down. When it comes to our brain and our nervous system, that brake pedal, that helps get us out of fight or flight, about 75% of it comes from the vagus nerve. So what happens is if the vagus nerve is on track and able to do its job, we get stressed, we come up, we push the brake pedal, and it brings us back down. The fire alarm goes off, we run outside the building, the fire department comes and they say, oh, guess what? It's actually all clear on the inside, you can all go back in now. Well, if you go back in and 10 minutes later your heart's still racing, even though the stress left, that's likely because your vagus nerve wasn't able to bring you back down. Your brain sees it safe, you know it's safe, but you go to put your foot on the brake and your car just keeps going. So that's one critical area that we look for in the body. And it's in this chart here. It's from the brain stem and it's this green nerve here. So step one is we want to assess, is your vagus nerve doing its job? Step two, and I'll talk about how we do that here in a little bit, is talking about that robber in a castle. If something's off in your body, it can be sending stress into your brain as well. Dr. Roger Sperry here has a quote of 90% of the stimulation and nutrition of the brain is actually from movement of the spine. So what this means is that every time your body's moving, if things are working properly, it's going to send good information into the brain to help it feel calm, help it feel safe, help it feel happy. What this means is that we have often, when it comes to anxiety, we think of our traditional senses. We think, as I mentioned earlier, maybe we are bullied by a boy in a red coat and we see another red coat or red shirt later on and it triggers a stress response. It's because that sight sense triggered fight flight in the body. Maybe we hear glass breaking or a car accident and we startle because it triggers that fight flight. If our amygdala is getting all this information, and so ultimately we see something, we hear something, we taste, touch, smell it, it sends information to our amygdala to either sound the alarms or to say, you know what, everything's safe, everything's good, you can be calm. And we focus a lot on anxiety with these 5 external senses because those are what we can identify in our environment. Those are coming from the external world, so it's easy to say that's a trigger, that's a trigger, that's a trigger, and try to block them out. But there's 2 internal senses. That is what Roger Sperry was alluding to, is that there's actually movement and body awareness senses that are calming for the brain as well. So the senses from inside the body, one is called proprioception. This is the most critical one to calm the brain, and it's the one that we're experts on in our office. It comes from all the little muscles and the little joints. And it's something that you would have heard of if you ever used a weighted blanket. That weight of the blanket is stimulating this sense, proprioception. That's why a weighted blanket can be used for anxiety. If your kiddos really like bear hugs or getting squished under a beanbag, if you go for a walk or go for exercise, you're moving all those joints, it's stimulating proprioception, it's calming for the brain. If you ever bump your funny bone, go, oh, what's the first thing you do? Right, put your hand on it, you start squeezing it. You're stimulating proprioception because it actually sends info to the brain to help calm the brain. So the other one we'll just go over briefly here is the vestibular sense. And yep, you can see it there. This one has to do with balance and movement. If your kiddo gets car sick, if they don't like roller coaster rides. This is a picture of my son Mason when he was very young, and we took him on this merry-go-round, and he went past the fight flight. There was initial kind of fight flight, but then he was in freeze mode until we took him off of it because it overwhelmed his system. It was a body movement sense that overwhelmed his brain and caused him to go into freeze mode, as opposed to an external threat that we normally think of as a threat. So these senses from inside the body can also cause it to go into fight flight or cause it to be calm. So the proprioception, as I said, is very calming for the brain. It's one of the kind of the safest senses if you want to calm the brain, is often something that works for pretty much anyone. If they do have a tactile sensitivity, maybe they don't like to be touched or tickled, they might have to move through that to, like, initially when the weighted blanket goes on, they might not like it, but often if they can sink into it, it'll be very calming for the brain. And the proprioception then comes, the majority, I've heard as much as 60% of all the proprioception, because it comes from the little muscles and the little joints, actually comes from the spine. So if the spine is off, suddenly your brain starts to lose this calming sense. And this becomes the robber in the castle that we see for so many families that we work with. Is something is off in their spine, and instead of getting calm going into the brain on a regular basis, it starts to cause stress to go into the brain. This is a video that when I'm doing this presentation live, I will play. Unfortunately, in the recording version like this, it won't come through well. So I have it here just to remind myself to share with you, when they hook electrodes up to the brain and they give adjustments, what they find is that the average adjustment helps connect and boost the prefrontal cortex by an average of 20%. So they've done this study many times in different researchers, different environments, and because the adjustment is putting good calm into the brain, it helps bridge that gap from fight-flight into the calming prefrontal cortex. So this is one of the keys that we see, is if that pattern is just fight, flight, fight, flight, fight, flight, and you're trying all these strategies, but it keeps boom, 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 popping the lid and activating that stress response. If something is happening in your kiddo's spine that's contributing to this, when we give powerful neurological adjustments, it helps create that connection and bring the connection into the prefrontal cortex. This was a study with one of the neurological techniques that we specialize in our office. It's called torque release technique, but it was published in Molecular Psychiatry, and we'll move through it kind of quickly here just from a timing standpoint. But what they did is they took a group of people, and one group they gave adjustments to, one group they gave placebo, and one group they didn't do anything. But basically they found the active group showed a significant decrease in anxiety, while the placebo group showed no decrease in anxiety. They were also going through some treatment in the hospital at the time, and they found the group getting adjusted went through it much more smoothly and did not need extra visits to the nurse, because their nervous system was getting into this calm and grounded state. So I'm going to share with you next how we look for it. I'll jump ahead here, show you these scans. But before we do that, I want to address, like, where does this stress come from, especially in a kiddo? What might throw their neck, their spine off and lead to these downstream effects? So when it's early on in life, we might look at something like emotional stress. How was pregnancy? Was it tough to conceive? Was mom busy? Was it already had 4 kids at home and racing around, working around the clock? And when baby finally did, Kim was already in that stressful environment. We know that the umbilical cord does, yes, it carries the blood, and we want to eat clean and clear toxins from our diet, but the umbilical cord is almost like a power cord where it's carrying the nervous system's energy. So whatever state mom is in, that carries that energy to baby as baby's developing. I know for my wife, with her own business, when she was pregnant with our son Mason, she was working really hard to try to get these things in order so she could take time off once he came. And so she was in a lot more stress than we wanted her to be in during pregnancy. Probably the biggest thing that we see early on in life then from a physical stress actually has to do with the birth process. Um, Whether it's maybe it's, I know myself, I was born with forceps. I'll give you some examples here. We had one girl who was born C-section, and to help pull her out by her head, they put a suction on her head. They started pulling, but the suction popped off. They had to put it back on, and then finally she came out. So there's a tremendous amount of pull, and usually as the doc's bringing baby out, they have to turn as well. We had a baby just this morning, 5 weeks old, who everyone thought he was head down, and mom was 7 centimeters dilated, so it'd go on through labor, baby starting to go through, and they all of a sudden see his butt instead of his head and realize, oh, he's breached. So they had to rush her to do an emergency C-section and pull him out. We've had babies where as the head is coming through, it should be moving through the pelvis, but maybe in a couple cases, the head was stuck in the pelvis, so each contraction was pushing on baby's head. So I share these not to scare you, but to know that the birth process, even in a smooth birth, is really stressful. We've checked babies after a really smooth, natural, no complications, everything went fine delivery, and even then things can be shifted out of alignment. So now you start to add, maybe the shoulder had to get pulled through. We had a mom recently who said, yep, hand was up by the head, and dad was actually reminding her of this, and so every time contraction happened, it was creating tension, and her heart rate was decelerating. Maybe the cord was around the neck. Lots of factors that the birth process can be involved here in throwing something off early. One of the keys too is if this is off early in the upper neck, not only is it going to lose out on good proprioception and send more stress into the brain, but as I showed in the picture previously, the upper neck is what controls the vagus nerve. So that now starts to prevent the baby from being able to access the brake pedal early on in life if the vagus nerve is off. So how do we look for this in our office then? How do we look to see, is there a robber in the castle? This is a scan that we do. It's called a thermal scan, and ultimately we're looking for symmetry and balance on both sides. So you can think of the brain and the nervous system. I showed the picture before of all the nerves going to the different body parts. You can think of it like a circuit breaker in your house. There's a circuit that goes to the kitchen and the bedroom. There's a circuit to the lights. If the lights are burnt out and you try a new light bulb and it still doesn't go out, you say, I bet you the circuit got blown. So we can measure along the spine to see if there's any stress stuck on any of these circuits. So this was the 8-year-old girl I mentioned earlier who mom said if she got stressed, she might spend half the day throwing up at home. A couple things with her also is her level of handling getting dressed with clothes. She had some sensory issues, so she would take an hour to get dressed in the morning. Because of this stress stuck state in her body, she happened to be more disorganized, so couldn't ride her bike, even though she was at an age where mom's like, I think she should be able to do it by now. Her brother, a few years younger, was able to do it. So when we did this scan, you can see we want to see white bars. Where we see color green, blue, red is mild, moderate, and severe. So in her case, yes, there's some area in her neck, and then there's actually a lot in the area that affects digestion. So it made sense for her when she got anxious that throwing up occurred because of how much stress was specifically in her digestive tract. Now the good news is we started adjusting her, and this is a scan a month later, just checking the dates there. And one of the things that mom noticed in this time is getting dressed in the morning went way easier, from an hour down to 15 minutes. She noticed that her daughter started feeling more calm, more peaceful. And when we were a couple months into care, Mom said, you know what? It's been a month now of any throwing up episodes in the morning. Something that used to happen regularly, suddenly her daughter wasn't doing anymore. And as we get a little more into care, Mom, and she's like, hey, you can go tell him. She's like, hey, I rode my bike today, because we started to get her whole system online, not only out of fight flight, but into that growth and healing mode. This was a teenage boy, 13-year-old, that we saw. And you can see on this scan, there's no white here. So basically what this one is showing is all these areas are, in a sense, robbers in the castle. All these areas are where stress is stuck on inside the body. So no matter what parents did from the outside, there was so much stress inside his system that it kept his brain in a constantly stressed state. His earliest change that we saw was a sleep standpoint. When he started, Mom and Dad said he would often get up at 4:35 in the morning and then just be up for the day, going. We started adjusting, and within a few weeks, Mom said, hey, guess what? We actually had to wake him up before school because he was still sound asleep when it was time to get up in the morning. So we started to allow his nervous system to get out of fight flight. And the cool thing with that is that it can go into healing mode and make some really, really cool changes. Here is a progress scan. Again, we tend to do them about a month after we start care to make sure everything is moving as expected. Still a lot of work to do, but you can start to see some whites coming into the play here. So it means his nervous system is starting to free up a lot of stress and get that stress cleared out of his body, which now this white can start to feed calm into the brain. And then the last story I'll share here, Nolan was 14 years old, and Mom brought him in when he was finishing 8th grade. It was that winter, and she said, you know, he's always been anxious, depressed, worried, and I'm really concerned about how he's going to do in high school next year. He took a long time to fall asleep at night. If he didn't know about something, if parents didn't give him all the details ahead of time, he'd be very nervous because it was unknown. It manifested as stomach pain, headaches for him inside his body. He also had a lot of congestion, sinus allergy issues. We started adjusting him. One of the first things, again, Mom said, oh, he's fallen asleep easier. One time she said, as his nervous system was calming down, he was out to the movies and someone was supposed to pick him up. That ride fell through and he called Mom, and normally he'd be calling in a panic like, the routine changed, something unexpected happened, I'm having a breakdown here. But he calls Mom, he's like, well, my ride didn't happen, can you come pick me up? And she was like, what? He was so calm. I don't believe it. As his nervous system calmed down, instead of being hunched and protected, he started opening up physically, better posture, opening up to the world, and then mentally, emotionally, socially starting to come out of his shell more. And Mom had sent me these pictures to be able to share with you guys. But we were then, it was in the summer before high school was starting, and Mom pulls me aside. She goes, Dr. Tye, can I tell you something quick? I'm like, sure. She goes, Nolan was just at his pediatrician visit, and the pediatrician asks, hey, how you doing? How you feeling for high school? And Nolan shares with him, he's like, you know, this is the first time I don't feel anxious, I don't feel worried, I don't feel depressed. And Mom starts to tear up, and I'm tearing up, and it felt so heartwarming to see that his nervous system could get out of the fight, flight, the response that's like all he knew his whole life. But to be able to get out of that and start to apply the brake pedal allowed his brain and his nervous system to start to feel some inner peace. And what we get so excited for in our office is, if the gas pedal is always on and it's always the go, 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 when a child starts to come down from that, now they start to have that buffer. Like I said before about the boy who cries wolf story, is if you're always in stress mode, you can't really tell when a new stress is coming at you because you just feel stressed anyway. When you start to come out of stress mode, you start to see, this is actually making me feel a little stressed. And you can reflect and recognize and bring yourself back down from it. It starts to give your kiddo yourself the awareness to know what is causing stress in your life from the external piece, and know what tools and resources really help bring you down from it. So it's so rewarding when we can see those changes with the people that we work with. I know some of you watching this have already been in our office and are under our care. If you're watching this and you're curious, like, what is the care look like for neurological chiropractic? There's basically one main thing to do initially, and that's to get checked and see what's going on. So on the first visit, we talk over what's happening with yourself, your kiddo. We talk about what your goals are. We do the neurological scans that I shared earlier and get all of your goals. Once we have all the data, we take that, we process it, we study it in our office here. And then on the second visit, when you come back, we go over. We say, all right, here's what we found. Based on what we found, if we can help, what does it look like for recommendations? What does it cost? And what is the plan to get your kiddo better? So if that's something you're interested in, please reach out. I'll put our contact info up here. If you have any future questions, reach out. If you do want to get checked, please mention that you watched this webinar, and we'll actually take half off your first visit. In our office, the initial eval to do the scans and go over them, it's $170. Since you watched this whole webinar, if you're getting to this point at the end here, number one, we want to say thank you and incentivize you to take action now instead of waiting another year, 2 years, 5 years. And two, because many people are saying, well, why does chiropractic help with anxiety? Because you've watched this webinar, you now know that, so it saves us some time of explaining what we do in our office, and we're happy to pass that savings on to you. So please reach out with any questions. If you're curious to know, is this stress stuck on inside of my body, my kiddo's body, please reach out and schedule an appointment to get those scans done. If you happen to be outside the Twin Cities, let me know, and we have a good database of docs throughout the US that can really help you or your kiddo as well. So thanks for watching, and we are here to help you and your family. Take care.